I think for me, Brixton in the 80s, and indeed Brixton now, was a vibey, multicultural place. You know, you got a sense when you came out of the tube, came out of the Victoria line, that you were coming into somewhere that was different. And indeed, in terms of the music, in terms of the food, because don't forget, in those days in the 80s, now you can be in Bournemouth and you can buy ackee and saltfish in the supermarket. Uh, Believe you me, in the 1980s in Bournemouth you couldn't, but in Brixton you could. So we could get the sort of foods that we wanted. You could buy plantains, you could buy yams. There was and there still is a vibrant street life. So the market then was even more lively than it is now. And for someone, you know, like myself, a young person who had been brought up when I was in the UK, in a place like Hemel Hempstead, where in those days there were very few black people, simply to be able to go into a shop and buy black hair products, that was a big thing. And you just felt you were part of a vibrant, international, multicultural community. And people got on. Black, white, African, Caribbean. It was in a happy place and a place where people stood together. And that's why when you look at the uprisings, you know, we should never forget that white people and white young people were actively involved in those alongside black youngsters. So it wasn't and never was a race riot. The Americans could never quite understand that. I remember being interviewed on ABC and NBC and that sort of show in the immediate aftermath of the uprisings. And they thought they were witnessing some sort of a race riot. So you just had to point out, well, actually, that wasn't the case. And that there was many white people involved as they were black, that this was a community that felt neglected. And we were neglected. You know, unemployment was high. We felt we were being unfairly policed. There wasn't investment in our infrastructure. And it was a cry of protest, really, about neglect. But the community came together. The community came together after the uprisings to deal with the fallout, and the community stayed together despite all the media interest and the sort of politicking that went on. And I think that's always been a good thing about Brixton. You know, we loved it and we were happy to live here. You know, for me, at every stage of my life, actually, it's always been important to get a balance between the life of the spirit and material life. You know, because you know there's more to us as human beings than simply the physical practicalities of day-to-day living, and there's more to the world than people making decisions on the basis of some sort of immutable market-driven economic rules. We are, as human beings, rich and complicated and muddled and wonderfully diverse, and you know, you can't understand that by mechanistic rules alone. So for me, to try and understand our world and to get through it, to have some sense of the life of the spirit has always been very important. And I come from an African tradition, the tradition in which I was brought up, in which for us living in those circumstances, this world, the world hereafter, and the world that went before in terms of our ancestors, they're all interconnected, and there's a sort of semi-permeable membrane. So you pass in and out these various different states, and that's why, for instance, just to give you a practical example of it, if you are an African, whenever I'm traveling in Africa, I'm always described not as Paul Boateng the lawyer or Paul Boateng the cabinet minister or the diplomat. I'm described as Kweku Boateng's son. Everybody is the son or daughter of someone else. And there's a totally different sort of relationship between the here and now and the past and the future. So for me, the life of the Spirit has always been important. And in terms of my own particular spiritual tradition, it's a Christian one. You know, I believe in the God of love. I believe in the sacrifice that our Lord made for us. I believe that if you embrace love as a driving force in the world, wonderful things can happen. Love not as some sort of soft sentiment, but love as a strategy. And I've seen it at work in the world. You know, I was around in South Africa as it happens, as a Christian ecumenical activist. I was vice moderator of the World Council of Churches program to combat racism. And I remember going to a church service in Soweto, in the height of the state of emergency of apartheid in 1988, a youngster, 12, 13, was arrested for giving out a hymn sheet in a service in which Archbishop Tutu and myself were preaching. He was arrested. Bishop Hurley, great Catholic bishop and activist for justice, and me, you know, a young British MP, went down to the police station to try and get him released. Didn't make a blind bit of difference at all. He was held in prison without trial, appeared 10 months later. And it was a vicious, racist regime, and everybody thought, except people like Archbishop Tutu and the people who embraced the gospel of love, everybody thought it would end with a bloody, violent revolution. And yet it didn't. And through the wonder, actually, of church and politics and trade unionism and just ordinary people in business, in the community, just coming together and saying, this can't work, this can't be right, and having a sense that there ought to be another way that was based not on violence, but on love, it changed it. Just as Martin Luther King changed things in the United States when they were fighting the Jim Crow laws and fighting racism and segregation in the US. So in all of those movements, the collapse of the Berlin Wall, you know, I can remember a time when people were smuggling Bibles into Eastern Europe. And the wall collapsed. So, you know, I see time and time again, even now in my life and my work on the development front in Africa, I see whole villages transformed in terms of their relationship to the soil, to the produce of the land, transformed in terms of their relationships one to the other by the gospel of love rather than of hate and division. And so I just see it happening around me. So I think there's a part of all of us that wants a spiritual life. And I think we have to embrace it and we have to find it in our own way. My way happens to be through a love of Christ. Others will worship Allah, will be Buddhists, will be Hindus. But I think not to have a faith at all and not to be seeking and going on some sort of spiritual journey, I think that would be very sad, because there's more to us than just, you know, bones and blood and sinews and impulses and mechanistic laws. You know, the life of the Spirit, and integrating the two. There was a great African educationalist called Dr. Agre, and he talked about the benefits of education. And he said the 3 R's are all very well, you know, reading, writing, arithmetic, But you've also got to have the three H's. Education of the head, so that you can be wise. Education of the hand, so that you can be practical. And education of the heart, so that you can recognize that what really brings about change in our world and transformation is the change in our hearts, that spiritual aspect of our lives, and getting that in the right place. And I believe that. I think my faith gave me a sense that my life had a purpose and that I ought to seek to fulfill that purpose. And that meant being pretty disciplined and being focused and finding joy in the skills and the opportunities that God had given me and that came my way. And I did that. But, you say stay off the streets. I mean, I stayed out of trouble. But I didn't stay off the streets because, excuse me, no one's going to tell me that I can't go out and about and go wherever I want to go, whenever I want to go. So I hope, I was street wise, but I had a focus in my life. I wanted to get those pieces of paper that enabled me to qualify as a lawyer. I wanted to be able to hold my own in any given situation. And I believed I could. And that's what I tried to do. So I stayed out of trouble in that sense. And I wanted, as one does, I wanted to make my parents proud of me. And I wanted to fulfill my potential. And did my faith help in that? Yes, undoubtedly it did. And I thank God for it. But my faith also helped me when things went wrong, and still does help me when things go wrong, because things go wrong, stuff happens, and nasty, difficult stuff happens. And my faith and the community and the certainty of God's love in my life and in the world, that's always been very important to me. It makes a difference between survival and success, because you've got to move. We can survive, but we want to do more than survive. We want to succeed, and my faith has helped me do that. Where'd you go to church? I don't think you can compare what happened last year with what happened in 1981. 2011 and 81 were very different. Because at the end of the day, 1981 was an uprising. True, there was a criminal element that came along and got involved and tried to take the opportunity to steal some stuff. But it was an uprising. It was an uprising against an oppressive policing system, against an oppressive economic state, a depressed and deprived neighborhood where people were not being listened to and where people were not represented. And it was sparked off by a particular policing operation in 1981 and by the killing and wounding of a particular individual in 1985. 2011 was almost like sort of shopping with violence. There was an element of just pure opportunistic criminality and planned criminality. And I didn't feel that the economic circumstances and the circumstances of policing were in any way comparable with those that occurred in 1981. But from all such incidents, you have to learn one lesson, that something is terribly wrong. Now, I think it's a different thing in 2011. In 1981, black people were not participating in the economy. They were not represented on the local authority in Parliament. They were not members of the police force. There was no police authority to hold the police to account. Young people were disrespected and had nothing. You know, it was a bad situation. 2011, something else is going on, and it's not that, but it is something. There is a sense of alienation. Undoubtedly, there is a sense of a breakdown of community and responsibility, one for the other, and there is a totally sort of amoral approach to acquisition. It seems to be okay just to take if you can. Now, that tells us something about the state of our society. So we need to listen to that and to learn from it. And we've got to find a response that isn't just about the criminal justice system and locking people up. We've got to ask ourselves how we build stronger and more respectful communities, how we give young people in particular a sense that they've got a stake in society, but how we take a greater degree of responsibility for our own lives and our relationships with others. Because what was striking too about 2011 were that there were people taking part who had jobs, who had careers, who had a whole heap going for them. It wasn't as if it was a action simply by the dispossessed. There was something else at work that I think is very worrying. So we shouldn't just have a knee-jerk reaction and say, well, lock them all up. That may be, the criminal justice system has to be part of it, but we also have to ask ourselves, where as a society are we going? How can we recapture our sense of community and our values? And I always think too, it's quite interesting to look at communities that didn't riot last year. I mean, I happen to live in one, in Wembley and in Harlesden, where are also diverse, multiracial communities, where there are a whole heap of issues, but there weren't riots, and there weren't people behaving as they behaved in Croydon. So we need to ask, what are we doing right as well as what are we doing wrong, and how can we do more that is right to stop this sort of thing?